Welcome to this Superversive SF live stream for Easter Sunday. Oh, no, Easter Saturday, I suppose, for everyone but me. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We're having a chat about Easter, the resurrection, and some of the books we've got coming out this Easter with the authors involved. Reggie, would you like to introduce everybody? Now, everybody's gone quiet. Oh, technical difficulties. What's going on? Judgy, where have you gone? All right, fine. I will introduce everybody.
Can you hear me now? I was talking, but apparently I had muted something. Sorry. I have this little, never mind. Hello, everybody. We have 3 wonderful Easter releases out from Superversive Press this weekend, and we have all 3 of the authors here with us. And they are Frank Luke, the author of Lou's Bar and Grill, 7 Deadly Tales. Lou Antonelli, the author of In the Shadow of the Cross. And Thomas Davidsmeier. You can repronounce that for me later. The author of Blessings and Trials. And they are 1 Christian fantasy novel, 1 Christian fantasy novel that's in a series of short stories but makes a whole, and 1 anthology of Christian science fiction. And gentlemen, maybe we could just take turns. Frank, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Tell us a little about your book.
Well, I had the idea for it a really long time ago, actually. I was in high school, and I was reading a bunch of Alfred Hitchcock anthologies and noticed that every one of them had 1 Faustian bargain, but only 1. And I found myself going through the books simply to read the bargains and then taking them back to the library. And I thought, well, what if someone wrote a set? You know, just a whole book of Faustian bargains. How would that go? And thought about it, forgot about it. You know, high school, college, went on. And then, it was fall of 2013. I was at work and started thinking, and suddenly I had the idea to do it again. And first I started working on a companion book to it, Joshua's Pawn Shop, and I had ideas for a couple of those stories. And then the Lou's Bar and Grill came into focus, and started outlining. The first one done was Wrath, Crazy Moon, and then Sloth, Six is Wild. And pretty soon I realized that at first it was just going to be 5. And then I realized that something like this, it needed to be 7. 1 for each of the 7 deadly sins. And that's where we got the structure of 7. And then it was just a question of writing and polishing. And
could you tell us a little about the premise? So you have 7 stories. Excuse me. You have 7 stories. Each deals with 1 deadly sin, but something is the same in each story. Could you tell us a little bit about what the Lou's Bar and Grill theme is?
Yes. In each of the stories, the characters, the human characters, let's say, wind up in a restaurant called Lou's Bar and Grill. It can be a saloon if it's an Old West story. It can be a health food place. It's been a rave in one of the stories. Just they always go to this bar where Lou, obviously short for Lucifer, Mo, the name for Asmodeus, and Sheila are demons, Satan and 2 demons, who tempt them into making deals. And it's always, they're always offering what you think you need.
One thing I enjoyed was the fun of waiting to see how Lou's looked in the next story, you know. where, each time they came upon it, you knew it was going to be there, but it came in, each time in a different way. And I think that led a lot of kind of cheer and interest to as you're going along, and you're seeing each story, and each story is the characters come upon the problems in different ways, and they have somewhat different outcomes. I thought you did a nice job of having some characters reoccur, some characters and tragically, others perhaps maybe they're going to succeed, and it really, I think, made it quite enjoyable, and that the nice kind of common theme of the way that the restaurant appears really helps tie it together.
Thank you.
I liked the way they all felt like old Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah.
That's what it reminded me of when I was. You said you got them from Alfred Hitchcock short stories, but they reminded me of old Twilight Zone episodes.
Alfred Hitchcock stories is where the idea started, but it was really, there was a lot of, I really liked the old Twilight Zone shows myself, and I was thinking a lot about Twilight Zone while writing them.
It feels like it. It works really well. I really enjoyed them.
And it has that, as you said, that Faustian bargain where they make a bargain, and then there's always some, something that trips them up, and sometimes it's quite unexpected how it works. I think Gluttony was the one that I found the kind of the eeriest and the strangest in how the deal worked. I don't want to say too much about it because we want to encourage people to read it and enjoy it. But it was a lot of fun to see the odd limitations of her being able to eat anything she wanted. That kind of thing, I think, really added to the book. And you said so. There's a companion volume, right? Which is, I believe you said that it's where people are gaining virtues instead of being tempted, or being encouraging virtues instead of being tempted to sins. Is that what the other one is?
Yes, Joshua's Pawn Shop. It's 5 of the 7 are done, and I'm looking forward to writing the next 2 very soon. But yes, it deals with the virtues and people looking for things that they have lost. Joshua's Pawn Shop is a place where you get a second chance.
It sounds like a great setup for stories of that kind, and maybe ones that are slightly more inspirational as opposed to slightly creepy ones of the Lou's Bar and Grill, which it sounds like they make a good companion. Anyway, we're quite excited about Lou's Bar and Grill, and I think people will really enjoy the stories, and they give it they both have a kind of inspiring quality to them as we're dealing with the subjects, and they also have an eerie quality to them. Kind of makes a nice mix. Lou, do you want to talk about your book?
Sure, of course. That's what I'm here for.
Tell us about.
I am not the Lou that runs the bar and grill, okay? This is a different Lou.
I will say that we have, by some magic, amazing quality, not gotten confused. We had a Lou author and a Lou title in the same release, and I was constantly afraid that we would get confused and we would be working on the wrong one. But we've actually kept them apart. So go ahead and tell us about your book.
Yeah.
It reminds me of an old newspaper joke where the New York Times had a mix-up in a feature page, and they mixed a picture of a Congressman Hamilton fish with an article about tropical fish. And they expected to get complaints, and they got a phone call from an irate person, and they said, well, I'm sorry, we just transposed the photos, Mr. Fish. And he said, no, I'm the tropical fish. Wise guys. It was a guy probably in the the same building. Anyhow, okay, what can I say about my collection? By the way, it's a collection. It's not an anthology. It's all mine. In 15 years, I've had 115 short stories published, from venues from Asimov's to outfits that have not published, gone any place. Really small venues that disappeared, And I noticed a couple of years ago that, I will not shy away from mentioning aspects of religion in general and Christianity in particular in short stories. And it occurred to me that, having as many stories published as I had, I could assemble a collection where Christianity or religious sentiment derived from Christianity would be crucial to the plot. So I did, and I pitched it to Jason, and it started because I submitted a story to Sci-Fi Journal, and that kind of got the ball rolling on that line of thought. And subsequently, I gathered 8 reprint short stories, and the collection includes 2 original stories. So, and it, pretty much ranges over a broad spectrum of settings and situations. A lot of them you find, like in the case of Frank's stories, you get a Twilight Zone vibe going on. One thing that's always struck me as an observer of daily affairs, because of my line of work, is actually how much of modern society is really pagan in origin. You could have a society, you could wake up one morning into an alternate reality that was pagan, and it would take you a while to figure it out. But
That's
like
really
in one of my stories in the collection, Saul Invictus, we have the normal situation where 2 boys get in a fight in high school over a girl. But since this is a pagan world, it's assumed to be a fight to the death. And actually the school officials arm the boys because they're pagans and they don't mind killing each other. Obviously, the world has a lower population than it does now. But, it's like, and a few of the stories go back to that, attribute aspects of modern society to pagan origins. Abortion goes back to the cult of child sacrifice and Moloch, and pornography goes back to, fertility cults, and alcohol and drugs goes back to Dionysus. I mean, it's all strong strains in our society, so I just kind of highlight them and point them out. Otherwise, I think it's entertaining and gives you some pause for thought. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of authors, if you're trying to make your stories marketable, will try to shy away from any overt references to religion because the leadership in the literary field is not religious at best. And I don't care, basically. I've got a real job, so I just write for my enjoyment. I literally don't care if I never sell a story. All the fun's in the writing.
Can you tell us a little bit about one or two of the particular stories?
Well, what was it? The Yellow Flag explains why is my answer to Fermi's paradox, which is why if there's theoretically so many planets that can harbor intelligent life, why haven't we been contacted? And my answer is because they took one look at our records and, God manifested himself with an offspring on all sentient races, and they find out we're the only one that killed him outright. And so we're quarantined because actually we're the worst planet in the universe. We're the only ones that killed the Son of God. Some places he may have been ignored, or some places it may have been misinterpreted, but nobody just killed him. That's also the story I sold it to Jason. Originally ran in Sci-Fi Journal, and at the time I set the record. I started writing it after lunch one day at work at 1 o'clock, and I finished it and sent it to him, and he accepted it by 5. So,
yeah, I really like Lou's stories.
Huh?
I really enjoy Lou's work.
Yeah, and I subsequently broke that record. One morning I got up and I had a commitment to write a story for one of the Superversive Planetary books. Which one was it? It was Don Witzke's. Oh, Earth. And I got up at 8.
Yeah, Earth. I heard this.
Coming out soon.
Yeah, I got up at 8, wrote the story at 9, sent it to Dawn, and she accepted it by 9:30. So I went from start to acceptance in an hour and a half. This is getting ridiculous.
That's amazing.
What other stories are in there? Well, being a journalist, I write real fast and pretty clean. Not perfect.
This is not related to your collection, but Lou wrote a story for our Venus anthology, and he typed it on an old-fashioned typewriter at a convention as kind of, as a floor show. And then he sent us the actual physical paper copy, and we accepted that. We later got a polished version that went into the anthology, but we really enjoyed being part of that experience.
Yeah, the wrong Venus. I always thought about that when I moved to Texas in the 1980s, and I went working in a newspaper. I ran across Venus, Texas, and I thought, This could be funny, you know, if like you had some sort of astronavigation in the wrong Venus, and instead of finding on the planet Venus, you land up in Venus, Texas. And you have to be to Venus, Texas to realize how quite confusing that would be. You know, that's the first place I think I saw tumbleweeds.
So in Lou's story, there's a prison in Venus, Texas, and there's a prison on Venus, the planet, and somebody gets confused about where they're going. It's quite amusing.
Yeah. My story that was a Hugo nominee in 2015, On a Spiritual Plane, is included. Not overtly Christian, but it deals with the subject of religious and religious sentiment, and the protagonist is a chaplain. Like I say, I think that some is setting out of space. One of my stories, what is Higher Powers, is about a spaceman who's stranded in a space capsule, you know, and he's facing death, running out of life support, and you know, aliens hear him making comments to himself with, you know, singing hymns. He realizes he's going to die, and they realize he can't be that bad if he has some religious sentiment of some kind. So they decide to rescue him. He says he has to be half civilized if he believes in God, you know. So
that's pretty cool.
Anyhow, I hope that's helpful.
That's very good, very interesting, and we're excited about getting it out there. Hey, Thomas, would you like to talk a bit about your book? I will
absolutely
start by saying I love your book, but I never know how to describe it. I always start to try to describe it to someone, and I go, well, it's a little bit like Avatar: The Last Airbender crossed with, and then I'm stuck because I can't think of anything else that has the same mood. But it's a really neat story. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting background. And so tell us about it.
Sure. It's very much an epic Christian fantasy novel. So it has a huge world with a huge setting that's all worked out, that you only get revealed a little bit at a time as you go through the story, which is why it's so hard to describe it and to give it a one sentence description. But if I had to, I'd say that it's basically the story of some persecuted young believers who have to set out in the world that's very hostile to them, because that world is inhabited by fallen angels that are incarnate, that have bodies, and people that believe in those fallen angels like gods. So you have a very challenging world for Christian believers who are essentially Christian believers, as this world has Christ who has come to it, similar to how Narnia has Aslan, a different Christ figure. But this world has a lot of different aspects to it. So things are interesting in the reveals as they come out piece by piece throughout the book. But I stay focused on the story. The story is really the important thing, laying out who these people are, what their motivations are, what these children are trying to do, as the main beginning story starts with some children. But there are a lot of different storylines interwoven together, and they weave back on each other, which is really neat. Something that I always really admired in other works and other novels. Gives it a lot of rich texture.
I'd like to say something about that and ask you a little bit about that, because I've read plenty of novels where there are different storylines and they interact. But in your novel, they don't take place in the same time periods. Some of the storylines are like ancestors or descendants of others. And how did you come up with that idea? And you do manage to get them to kind of intertwine with each other, and we can see that they kind of are going. But I thought it was really unusual, and I was just curious how you came up with that idea.
Well, I came up with the idea for the novel in a lot of different little chunks and pieces. The whole series is probably about 6 books long. So this first novel represents about a sixth of the whole storyline, which all weave together and come back together. Two major influences would be Metachronopolis, The City Beyond Time, which is the John C. Wright book, and also the movie Memento, which, if you watch it, is actually a series of vignettes that go backwards in time.
Yes, I was just describing that movie to someone.
Yeah, and it's a terrific idea, and playing around with time was something that really appealed to me. I love when that's done well. And so what I started to think about was, what if I had a single place? And there's this little village and backwater area of this world that I've got set up. It's called Our House, which is an interesting, it looks different than that, but that's how it sounds when you pronounce it. So it's kind of a neat little play on things. But that's where the storyline start, the three major storylines start, is within that little town. Yet they start with different people at different times in completely different situations, which I think is a really neat and different way to approach it. And I've really enjoyed putting it together.
One of the reasons I find it hard to describe is it's a fantasy story where things like happen, like people fight dragons. Has kind of a rich levels of society where it remind me almost of reading I don't know, Gene Wolfe, or like when you get to the parts where people are in there dealing with the once he gets on one character goes on a ship ride and he starts interacting with the city and things, that where the hierarchies and the bureaucracies are, and it has this sense of this Christian like group called sojourners who are in some places actually persecuted, in other places they're just kind of aware persecution might come. So they're living carefully, I guess you might say. And then it has these fallen angels walking around fighting each other up the planet, right down the road, and people worshiping them and things. And then they have these powers. And the reason I said like airbenders, that they have, there's not exactly like that, but the powers are kind of seem to be element based. Though I gather there's more than just 4 of them. There's a number of different powers. But they're characters, and they call them blessings, who have these powers that allow them to, control wind or water. And some of them are twice blessed; they can do 2 things. And the whole thing blends, kind of woven together really beautifully, so it feels like one solid whole. And as I said, that's one reason I've had trouble describing it, because I'm like, hey, I read this great book, and what do I tell you about it? It's hard to compare it to other things. But it does have, children trying to get back to their parents, and people seeing a falling star and trying to figure out what it's going to be, and should they go pick it to find out what's there, and is it going to be something dangerous? And all sorts of really interesting, and people trying their powers and getting to use them more, and some kind of strange or creepy things going on too. So it's overall, I think, quite an interesting and rich background, and a great start for, many, hopefully it'll be many adventures by the time you get to the end of your 6 books.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm working on book 3 right now. Book 2 is actually done, and hopefully well on the way in the pipeline to getting released soon. And then I'm working on book 3 right now. And in fact, this morning I was writing a scene that I was really enjoying. There's a fallen angel that's a perspective character for parts of the different story. And he's just, it's an it, but I kind of think of him as a he. And it's just a really interesting character that you get to play around with a lot of ideas and trying to express things from a perspective that's very different, that's very un-Christian. And as someone who, of course, before I became a Christian, was definitely a fallen man, it's interesting to be able to bring that stuff back and try and illustrate some of the ways that fallen people and fallen angels perhaps think about things and lie to themselves. A little bit of Screw Tape Letters to that. As C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are huge influences on me. And so that's the Tolkien is the epic size and scape of the world, with the societies and civilizations and things working together like that. And then the C.S. Lewis is perhaps a little more of the internal stuff, with a little more of the spiritual exploration and thinking about those ideas. Maybe a little bit of Paralandra from the Space Trilogy in there as well, as far as mood and theme and ideas.
One of the things that I thought was interesting was there's a whole thread where, and I don't remember if it's in book 1 or starts in book 2, but one of the characters is young, and a second thread where the same character is an old man. But it didn't make the section when he was young any less scary. I thought something might happen to him. I'd see in the back of my mind, I'd go, well, he probably doesn't die here. But, it was still quite gripping, and that's one thing I thought. And it took me a little while as I was reading through it to figure out that it was all these different time periods. It really gives a feeling of, it gets that richness that you get from different viewpoints and then some, because you're looking at it from different places in space and from different places in time.
Yeah, and the town that is the main starting point has an evolution and a development through the course of these 3 different time periods, which cover about 70 years, the start of the 2 of the 3 the outside two of the storylines, the other one's in the middle, obviously. That covers about 70 years, and there's a major change that happens at this location in this place, which is kind of inspired by the Gates of Splendor, if you know that true life story of Nate Saint and the other missionaries that were killed in Ecuador. So there's all sorts of background things that really come together and get woven into it that you might not necessarily see or realize on the front, but that's where all that texture comes from, is working in all these different ideas and feelings and attitudes that I've always felt were very emotionally connecting and important as far as carrying a Christian message out there within fiction, while still keeping a good, entertaining story that's exciting and has things happening. It isn't just people talking at you about why you should be a Christian, but rather showing you what it is to be a Christian, what it means to struggle with your faith and struggle with the idea of, I have a responsibility because I've been given these abilities, or I've been given this place in life and society. How am I going to use it for God's glory or for the good of my fellow man, for God's for the worship of God and for the bringing of glory to Him.
Sorry, I was waiting to say something, and I started listening to what you're saying about God, and it went right out of my mind.
I love you.
Sorry about
anyway,
that.
No problem. What you were saying was more important, but it'll come back to me. It was some comment. Oh, I think it was just that I like the difference in the attitude that the sojourners had towards their blessings, which they thought of as a blessing they had to use to serve.
No, still on. Other people
the people who had blessings who weren't sojourners, who had a much more kind of, Machiavellian attitude towards it. I thought that was pretty neat.
To be honest, that comes a little bit from Magneto in the X-Men, who's probably one of my favorite villains of all time. And to have that kind of thought that you're within humanity, but you're separate, you're better, you're special. So that does kind of come through there, and it comes through a little more in some of the next books, where I've got in this third one, I'm getting ready to write a section about a blessed person or a talented person. They call themselves different things in different situations. Obviously, unreligious people or irreligious people aren't going to call themselves blessed, but one of these guys, you get to see a story of him growing and developing and becoming and maturing as just a worldly person who has these blessings, and what that does to him, and how that changes his point of view, and how he looks at the world and how he behaves.
It's pretty cool. Hey, Lou, could you tell us a little bit, just as background, about your experience buying a newspaper? How's that going? It's very exciting.
Well, I went to work for the newspaper here in Clarksville, Texas, Red River County, start of 2015, and it'd been owned by the same people, the same family for 40 years, and the publisher was in his 70s, and the family had been slowly divesting itself of its properties, and they made it a suggestion that they sell the newspaper to the employees. And my wife and I were able to get the financing through private auspices to purchase it. So it's worked out really well, because I'd already worked there a couple of years, and my wife came on board as the financial person. She most recently worked as a school teacher, but she was a accountant before we married. So they only could work because of her involvement. And one of the things that happens when you have a business that has been owned for a long time, and then people want to sell it, is it kind of gets run down because they lose interest in it. They don't buy new equipment, and they don't look after it as much. So then what happens is you come in as a new owner, and you're all gung-ho, and you have all sorts of plans, and you can take off. And it's worked well. It's been time consuming, but honestly, I've gotten a great sense of satisfaction out of it. You all probably think of me as a writer, and I really never thought of myself as a writer. I'm a journalist, and writing was my hobby. And so, since I'm basically spending all my free time working at the newspaper now, and I find it much more satisfying. I don't get, let's face it, you don't get much satisfaction if you're a Christian writing speculative fiction because everybody hates you. So it's like being a Christian in the world. Everybody hates you. But
Yeah.
I'm in a position where I live, I've found over the years when I try to explain to people where I live and work with every day, the kind of abuse I've gotten as a writer, they don't understand what I'm talking about. They don't know, basically the United States is a heathen country, and because it's not like it's here, so they don't understand how somebody could just say, well, you're a Christian, so you're stupid because all Christians are stupid and believe in Jeebus, and it gets tiresome, I'm 61. I can do what I want. So I kind of take it with the success of the newspapers being a sign that's why I'm putting a lot of my effort. And I'm writing, new stuff because I have previous commitments to fulfill, ghostwriting, to do. But otherwise, I'm not writing any new stuff and sending them out to the slush pile. Not for the time being. I'm really enjoying working at the newspaper. In the Shadow of the Cross is mostly a reprint collection, and we got it assembled last year anyhow. So it's really nice that it's coming out now, and it's a good way for some people to see my fiction. But you know, let's face it, in the United States as a whole, there's no advantage to being a Christian. Most people wouldn't bring up the fact they're a Christian. I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, uh, so many foreign people, foreign countries, they attack us. We think of I don't know what people think Muslims don't like America. There's people try to make it sound like they don't like our power, or they don't like our influence, or they don't like the way we interfere in other nations' internal affairs. But you got to remember, one of the basic tenets of Islam is fighting Satan, and as far as they're concerned, we're it. You know,
Yeah.
as far as moral relations are concerned, internationally, we're the bad guys. We're generally defending the bad things as society, and I kind of think that's another reason why people call us stupid. It's like, I wish you guys would, realize that you're a heathen country. You speak a good game, but you don't certainly don't practice it. So I'm content. One of the nice things is where I live, I don't have to apologize for being a Christian. I have to worry about that kind of stuff. So I'm much more comfortable. I'll give you a good example. This live stream is going to be recorded. It's going to be archived. Okay, there are going to be people who are going to check this and report on it and mock us in online venues. There were people like Adam Troy Castro and Jim Hines. I mean, this is what they do. They're informants for the bad guys, and they will look and then they'll put what we say in here. If we say anything defending Christianity or religion or civilization in general, and they'll mock us and call us, idiots and fools. So I've gotten to the point in my life I don't need to deal with that. It's a poor investment of time. So the newspaper is a much more enjoyable investment of my time because I was a journalist. I started as a journalism when I was in high school. I just picked up writing, when I was in my 40s because I learned, basically having spent so many years writing in newspapers, I got the writing down. I just had to come up with the plots. I literally, in all the years I've submitted stories, I never had an editor say a story was poorly written. Now they've said stuff like, "Well, your characters are flat, or your plot doesn't make any sense," but nobody's ever said they were poorly written. I think people underestimate how much of a hurdle that is for aspiring writers just to get the English language, into your bones, so you can just write it effortlessly and not, sweat over it. So then,
boy, I'll agree with that. That's absolutely true. Just when you've got the ideas in your head and you just want to get them out on paper, and they come out, and as Tom Simon says, your style is your rocket. I think a lot of times, at least for me, when I'm first writing it out, that rocket goes put, 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 and then falls over on the launch pad and bursts into flames. Because there's just so many ideas piling out on paper all at once, and sometimes you're just not being as clear as you can. But yeah, what Lou's saying there about the English language and getting it into your bones, and I'm noticing that the more and more that I write, as I go on, I'm catching myself and changing the way I used to say things and used to write things, and really helping to improve my ability to communicate what I'm trying to say in these stories. To help the readers make a better connection with the people, the characters that are in those stories, and get my style kind of out of the way, so it can be about the journey and the destination and not about the rocket.
Yeah, and you know, as I said, I've written stories and got them accepted in 4 hours and an hour and a half, so I don't have to worry about that. Of course, working at a newspaper, I worked at a daily. I was the managing editor of a daily newspaper once, and I could write a story and see it printed in the newspaper within an hour. If I was, you know, right up against the deadline and writing something on deadline, and write it in 10, 15 minutes and get it typeset and be printed. So to me, that's normal. That's not normal in, you know, in the world otherwise. But the newspaper, you know, this newspaper that my wife and I bought was founded in 1873. It's the oldest business in the county. It's got a good base and a lot of community support. The main thing we have to deal with is demographics, but community newspapers have always, the readership has always been skewed towards older demographics because only people who have lived in a city a long time, own property, are concerned about taxes, and want to follow local government will tend to read the local newspaper. Young couples in their 20s with a few kids don't care about local affairs so much. So the demographics have always been skewed to the older population. Problem now is, years ago, that would be true, but people 30 and under occasionally would read a newspaper. Problem now is, there's people under 30, I don't think they know what a newspaper is. They're completely cut off. They only get this stuff off the internet. And Facebook is horrible. I mean, you know, even in the newspaper's Facebook page, we have to monitor it exceedingly carefully because gossip, and Facebook is just gossip, always goes negative. And, you know, in our case, you know, we have to moderate the comments and ban people because they're only going to say negative, hateful things. It's just appalling. And of course, you all see that in Facebook all the time. But here, you know, I'm dealing with a Facebook page that's affiliated with a newspaper, and people do the same things. That's ridiculous. And they'll say on Facebook, like, we reported this story. No, you're full of it and you're lying. Well, I'm sorry. Okay, my wall, my rules. Ban. You know, I think Facebook is the most pernicious influence in the country today, and I'm wondering if someday something's going to happen on Facebook where somebody's going to proliferate something, some meme or some lie that's going to be, this is how a civil war will start. Somebody will say something, it'll spread so fast and be so evil that people will actually start running outside and shooting each other. And it's ridiculous. Who saw that coming?
Well, you're saying this in a group of fiction writers, and I imagine that one of us will now write that story.
we could have a series of evil Facebook.
I have a story coming out in a
Boxer Rebellion.
Oops.
What did you say, Jason?
Isn't that sort of the story of the Boxer Rebellion? Someone made up a story, got it in the newspaper, it got spread to, if memory serves, China, and started a riot.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. So, you know, it won't be the first time it's happened if it happens because of Facebook. We have a question from a listener, if I can, now that we've got a slight break. The listener observed it's interesting the way Christianity has sort of been turned on in the West as the West sort of reverts back to, I guess they call it post-Christian. Probably for many people it'd be back to pre-Christian times because they've never heard of it. But one question he had, do you guys, meaning you three authors, do you get flack from other Christians for being fascinated with or writing stories with magic, science fiction, fantasy aspects to them, like dragons, etc.? Because, you know, we've seen the way some people, I'll say slightly crazy people, reacted to Harry Potter. So do you guys, as Christians, get grief from other Christians for doing fantasy and science fiction stories?
Well, I am in a relatively conservative church that has a lot of homeschool families. Almost all of us are homeschool families there. And yeah, there is a little bit of concern over that because there's so many situations where these story elements are connected to stories and plots that are evil, that are bad, that are drawing you away from God. And so, yeah, sometimes it's very easy to mistake the drapes and the window dressings for the window for the important inside parts of the story. But most of the Christians that I talk to and deal with, we're all thinking people. We're people who come to our faith because we've looked at and considered other things. We're not as knee-jerk as that might be. Now, people having a negative reaction to Harry Potter may have more to do with the fact that it was evil than necessarily it being just rejecting magic in general. It might have been because J.K. Rowling was creating an anti-hero that was a twerp that all these kids started to look up to. Now, while it was fun, it was very fun. It was a fun story. I could go on and on all day about that one.
Lou or Frank, do either of you have a comment about?
Yeah, I have received that. I'm also an associate pastor, and I have been asked at times, why am I wasting my time on these stories? Why aren't I writing devotionals? Why aren't I writing more sermons? Why aren't I writing Old Testament theology books and doctrine books? And I tell them those are good, and yes, I do write them, but story hits people. There are people who would read a fantasy novel that would never pick up 10 central elements of the Old Testament. They'll never pick that up. But you can put it into a story form, and they'll remember it later.
I think that's true. How about you, Lou? Do you have any Christians complaining about your Christian science fiction, or do you kind of just get support down your area?
The area I live in, and there's so many Christians, and we're such fundamentalists. There's really nobody. The county I live in has about 15,000 people. I know 3 people who read science fiction. I know them all. They all. It's not a genre. It's not a genre that attracts Christian, because it usually, as soon as you open up the average book, it's usually hostile to, what's that joke about the. Somebody said, if you want to be a success in SF, you need to answer these 3 questions. Do you hate God? Do you hate yourself? Do you hate the United States? And people here very much, patriotic Americans, good Christians. They just don't read it. I can't talk to people about it. People I associate with on a daily basis have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Nothing I can do about that.
And it's not necessarily anything wrong with if they not looking for it, but I as a Christian fantasy author, I run into another problem with this, which is if you write non-Christian fantasy, a lot of Christians will read it. But the moment you write Christian fantasy, you offend somebody. Because if you merely say anything about Christianity, it's not what some particular sect thinks. And, so I found that I have to, put together, I think of it as an analogy. My story is an analogy. I'm not writing my particular theology. It wouldn't make a good story. So, I try to, but occasionally that just offends somebody because they're like, oh, this never happened, or, hell isn't like that. I'm like, it's a story. It's supposed to be reaching your heart. It's not really supposed to be telling you, what to believe and what to put in your sermons. But I have seen that.
Well, after a certain point in any writing, you have to just decide to go ahead and do what you're going to do, and not worry about, because somebody's going to be offended by anything. We have the joke in the newspaper business that if you're concerned about not offending anybody, you can't even print the school lunch menu, because some little old lady is going to be offended when you mention that they're having a chicken breast for lunch at the school. Breast, say white meat. So you just can't win. But that's one of the reasons why the Facebook and the internet's been so pernicious. Because we have a country of 300 million people, and like one person can start a fuss and veto everything out for the 299,999 people, literally. And you're not going to get anything done in society if you're going to have individuals vetoing an entire nation's actions, which is almost coming.
I believe it was the Christian columnist Matt Walsh who put out an article a few years ago where he had tracked the public outcry, where they had been claimed there was a conservative Christian public outcry on 2 or 3 major issues. And it came down to 2 people on Twitter One time it was a 12-year-old. One 12-year-old on Twitter had said something, and it had gone all across the country as conservative outcry. And it's just outrageous the way that, as you say, one guy says something and suddenly that's a major opinion. But 50 million Christians saying it, and they don't listen.
Well, I suppose it doesn't suit their narrative when 50 million Orthodox believers say something sensible, but when one says something stupid, so they can use it as a cudgel, oh, well, then I'll run with that.
The only other question that I had was, Frank, I know you have one or two other works you're working on. Did you want to take a moment or two just to talk about some of the other things you had coming up?
Sure. I've got stories submitted to different pieces of the Planetary Anthology. We'll see which ones of those come out. Hopefully most of them. I've got five there right now. And beyond that, I've also got one called Rebirths. I have got that to the polishing stage and sent it on for reading. That one, it will be a relaunch because it's revised, expanded, and one of the first readers wrote back to me that he said, if C.S. Lewis had played Elder Scrolls, this is the book he would have written instead of Narnia. And
it's an interesting. I've read that one. It's interesting because it's about a man who loses his faith and goes wrong, very, very wrong, and then begins to realize he's wrong and try to find his way back. So it's quite also a fantasy.
And I was also exploring the G.K. Chesterton statement there that evil knows no lower bound.
Interesting. Yeah, you do kind of get that in that story. Well, that's the end of the questions that I have. Jason, did you have any, or should we give each gentleman a few minutes to make any additional statement they'd like?
I only had one question for Lou briefly about running a newspaper in this day and age. I remember he saying it was actually going pretty well and being successful. And I just want to say that's really surprising because all of the newspapers seem to be circling the drain. Maybe there's more about maybe newspapers aren't dead. It's just the people that are running the big ones don't know what they're doing anymore. Anyway.
Well, I mean, I can explain that.
Yeah, go on.
You need to think of small community newspapers and large daily metropolitan or suburban papers as actually two different kind of businesses.
Oh, okay.
You think of nonfiction and fiction where they're both writing, but the two different kinds of writing. Big city newspapers today have a lot of competition from other media. They tend to have the sole responsibility in their communities for reporting, but that means they duplicate a lot you can get on radio and television and now the internet. And so people don't have to read the newspaper to find out what's going on in the world. The other problem they face is they're mostly chain-owned now. Newspapers are not, because newspapers pay for themselves with advertising. Subscriptions only carry a fraction, 25% at most, of the cost. So you're going to have 3/4 of the income of a newspaper from advertising. It's all accounts receivable. And what happens is the cash flow can drive you crazy. Trust me. You literally have days when, you come to the office and you get nothing in the mail. You just go, would everybody get up and look around in the morning and sniff the air and look at the sky and go, well, I'm not going to pay anybody. I'm not going to pay the newspaper today. Nobody sends in any payments. So the cash flow is terrible. And they're not profitable enough. A good newspaper, a well-run newspaper can pay for itself and can be in the black. But in general, especially now, they're not profitable enough to produce dividends. And if you're owned by a chain, you're going to want the dividends. And so as a result, they start to try to squeeze squeeze money out of them, and the cost-cutting measures will drive the quality down, because it's not like McDonald's where you can increase the number of employees during busy times and cut back the number of employees. You have to keep it's a knowledge business. It's not a warm body business. Now, the thing is about small newspapers, that's still mostly locally owned. My wife and I own the paper. When I get the mail, I make a deposit, I walk down the block, and I go to the bank and put it in the bank. We're not paying dividends to anybody. We're just paying the employees, and we're paying ourselves a salary. So you don't have that problem. And also, we're right there, and we're close to the community, so we are able to react much faster and better to events and trends. And also, I just was going to say something and I forgot, but there will be weekly print publications years after the last print daily publications disappear, because it is a totally different kind of business. The only problem now is, because people think newspapers are going to disappear, is there may not be a generation to take over the smaller weekly papers that continue running for 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, and then since they're not going to know how to do newspapers, they'll mess them up anyhow. Because like any other business, if you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know what your audience is, you'll mess it up. But newspapers have never done well as a chain-owned business. That's a historic issue, and the two types of journalism, the community journalism and the major media, is different. And also the politics is different. The mainstream media in this country has been very liberal for a long time. Some of you all may recall back in the 1990s, David Duke in Louisiana was a candidate for governor. He finished in the runoff, and he was like one of the two candidates for governor. And the mainstream media was going bananas because of Duke, because he was a Klan. He'd been in the Klan, and he was racist. So there's definitely issues with candidacy. And you listen to the mainstream media, and they were just completely demonizing him, which probably was justified. But mine was working at the time for a newspaper that belongs to the Texas Press Association. And when you have annual press contests where you judge journalism, you judge the news writing, you judge the layout, you judge photography, you need to swap with another press association. You can't judge your own entries. So Texas swapped with Louisiana. So editors from Louisiana judged the Texas contest and vice versa. So I'm a Texan editor, so I judged the Louisiana contest entries. And I'm going through the weekly newspapers, because that's where I work. And I was flabbergasted, because all the small weeklies in Louisiana were supporting Duke. The sentiment in the rural areas and in the small towns was completely different in the mainstream media. They had no problem with Duke. They thought he was the better candidate. So there's always been that divide between the big, it's urban, rural, big cities, little cities. I think the problem today is that people in the big cities and the elites don't even know what the people out in the rural areas are thinking. And that's like probably one of the reasons why Trump's victory snuck up on everybody so bad. It's like they had no idea what people were thinking out, in the flyover territory. And they didn't see it coming. So in a similar way, people say, well, print is dead and everything's going to go online. And in small towns like this, I probably, I'm 61. I may still live to not see a print publication stop. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if someday I hear there's no print paper in Dallas or Houston. That may happen, but not in the small towns. But we're close to our subjects, and we're very responsive to the people. No bureaucracy, and we're content with a much lower profit margin. Like I say, we're not sending dividends to other places. I hope that answers your question, if that makes any sense.
That's really neat, Lou. Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing that. John and I used to, John mainly, but I occasionally worked for a small community paper back in Maryland years ago, and I appreciate hearing your take on it. Well, Frank or Thomas, either of you want to sign off with any particular thing you'd like to share, either about your book, about Easter, or about anything?
Well, I just love to wish everybody who's watching or listening to this podcast here to have a wonderful Easter, celebrating the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I know we've mentioned the idea of persecution and the idea of America being a less and less Christian society. But I would encourage everyone to stay true to your Lord and Savior, stay true and continuously repent of your sins, become a better person, and grow more mature in Christ. And I hope that our books that we're offering here are going to help you do that, are going to give you encouragement, maybe lift your soul in a dark time, or give you a new view of the world that might help you to see a better way to serve God in your own life.
Thank you. Frank, any last thoughts?
I'm just going to say, he is risen. He is risen indeed.
Thank you. Well, thank you, all three of you, for coming. We both enjoyed hearing about the books and really enjoyed hearing what Lou had to say about newspapers. That was really quite interesting. Happy Easter,
does not
everyone.
mean that people. That does not mean that people can start sending me their resumes. Okay? I've got it covered. Trust me. No. Just happy.
But they
Easter.
can't go out and buy your book, which is now out there for people to enjoy.
Yes, I expect that I'll need a wheelbarrow to carry the royalty checks when I go to the mailbox. No,
wouldn't that be great? All right, gentlemen, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Happy Easter, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason?
All right. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And go out and pick the books up. They are really good. I enjoyed them.
Yeah,
and
they really are.
convince all your local people to give them a try.
Yes, and to all the people who are watching this to spy on us for the bad guys, Jesus loves you too, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Very true. Thank you, Lou.
I will stop there. That's a great note to end on.